The trenches of France and Flanders drew men like a machine to and from the front. What remains of that crimson coast in northern France, where thousands arrived on their journey to the battlefields, and men returned shattered from their experience along the old front line? We tend to think of the battlefields of the Great War in isolation, particularly along the Western Front, as if the events of the conflict only happened in places like Arras and the Somme and Ypres. But the world of the Western Front was much wider than those battlefields themselves, and behind the British front was this vast infrastructure that the British Army increasingly invested in as the war went along. And in many respects, when you look at the path to victory in 1918, there's a clear connection between the development of that infrastructure and success and victory, because without the ability to resupply your men, whether that be with ammunition, equipment, weapons, food and water, or reinforce your armies with men themselves by resupplying troops to the front line, then your chance of success, your chance of victory is greatly diminished. And this was something that essentially grew, particularly within the British Expeditionary Force, including all of the British and Commonwealth nations fighting there, and was perhaps less apparent on the German side, particularly in that last phase of the war when submarine blockades strangled Germany and men were almost starving at the front. And you see the attacks of that final year of the war often breaking down because German soldiers stopped to pick up rations from British supply dumps that they have overrun in their advance, be that in the Kaiserschlacht on the Somme in March, or in Flanders in April, or on the Chemin des Dames in May of 1918. So in terms of these battlefields, when we look away from them, we look behind the lines. And this week we're going to look at the so-called Crimson Coast. And this is a phrase that comes from a diary of the Great War that referred to that coast as the Crimson Coast because of the large number of wounded coming back there during the Great War, returning from the fronts, from those great battlefields, shattered because of the fighting. And a lot of blood had been shed along that coast in trying to treat and save the lives of these men, and so many had not survived, as the great cemeteries that lie there today testify to. And that Crimson Coast is not just a place where the wounded came to for treatment and where soldiers died. It was also part of the turning wheel of the Western Front, because it was a place that sent men to the front. It was the place where the depots, the base depots of the British Army were located. So because of this, because of its importance in the medical evacuation of soldiers from the battlefield and the arrival, training, preparation and dispatch of soldiers to the front, in many respects you could argue that this area of the Crimson Coast is just as important a place as the battlefields themselves, and an understanding of what happened on those battlefields really isn't possible without an understanding of these places behind the lines. And increasingly on the old front line we will begin to look at some of these behind the line locations on different parts of the front, because they are fascinating places to visit and they tell us a lot about the history of the Great War. So for our first journey along the Crimson Coast, and we won't be able to do it justice in one episode, it's a journey we'll continue with in due course, we're going to look at two key locations that gives us an insight into the medical history of this part of the Great War, and also the military training facilities, the base depots that enabled soldiers to arrive at the fronts, sort those soldiers out and then send them up the line where they were required, something that became more and more important as the war went on. And we're going to do that with two specific locations, Treport and Etaples. And in doing so, we'll be making a little journey up along that Crimson Coast. One, like I say, we will continue in future podcasts, but we'll start at Treport, a famous French seaside town, favourite of Parisians to come here, particularly during the summer months. Many wealthy French landowners had holiday homes here. Monsieur Gans, the mayor of Courcelette in 1914, this is where he spent the war when he fled from his native village. But it's not that we're going to look at today, it's the British Army in Treport, and that's where we'll start. When the British Army arrived in France in August 1914, it brought with it a degree of infrastructure to be able to supply its armies in the field. The British Expeditionary Force then was quite small, just a handful of infantry divisions with cavalry, artillery, engineers, and Royal Army Medical Corps as well to deal with the expected casualties. But it was a mobile war that they'd prepared for, and once that mobile war was over and went static, those in charge of the medical services had to think again as to how they might treat the wounded efficiently, safely, and to maximise the chances of a soldier surviving his wounds. So when the front went static, actually in many respects it made that job easier because their medical services weren't spread out over a large area with armies always on the move. They were now static, holding a part of what had become the Western Front. So they began to take over locations to facilitate this evacuation of troops from the front line. Now, we've talked about medical evacuation before. On the battlefields, the first port of call is the regimental aid post, where the battalion medical officer, the RMO, the regimental medical officer, is there to treat the wounded, picked up by his battalion stretcher bearers. They're then handed over to the Royal Army Medical Corps at an advanced dressing station or a main dressing station nearby, and they're treated there again. Their wounds are redressed. They ascertain what further treatment is required, and then they're dispatched to the next medical location, which is a casualty clearing station much further from the front, occupying a square mile of ground, where there are surgeons, there are nurses, and this is the first proper full-size medical unit that these men find themselves at. From the casualty clearing stations, they then move further back to base hospitals behind the lines, whether these are general hospitals or stationary hospitals. And from the very early period of the war, the British Army began to use the coastal belts of France to place these stationary and general hospitals. In some cases taking over hotels because they were big, airy buildings that could easily be used as a makeshift hospital. In some cases it was factories or warehouses, and in some cases they took over a big plot of land and they built effectively a temporary hospital there with wooden huts and with tents. So the idea of using these coastal locations, numerous locations, was so you didn't didn't send your wounded all to one place because it could overwhelm whatever facilities were there. So if we look at the period of the Battle of the Somme, for example, about halfway through the war, by then the Crimson Coast, stretching from in Normandy right up towards the Pas-de-Calais in northern France, there were 25 general hospitals and 14 stationary hospitals in locations like Boulogne, Etaples, Calais, Le Havre, Rouen, Dieppe, Le Treport, Abbeville, all places that had good communications routes coming into them, whether by road or by rail or preferably both, and also the facility to move men if they required treatment back in Britain from those coastal locations to the nearest port to be evacuated on hospital ships back to dear old Blighty, back to Britain. So Le Treport, being a typical coastal location used by the British Army, became one of these important hospital centres. It was on a good rail link from the battlefields of the Somme up into northern France, so wounded could be easily evacuated by the Railway Operating Division of the Royal Engineers on trains back from the casualty clearing stations to the general hospitals that were here. And by the time of the Battle of the Somme, there were 3 general hospitals at the Treport, number 3, number 16 and 2nd Canadian General Hospital. And these general hospitals were quite big. They covered several square miles of ground. As the war went on, they used existing buildings. They created special wards from wooden buildings, specially constructed huts. There were tents for personnel and for any overflow of wounded during particularly busy periods. And it would have looked like a small town, really. And within it was a broad spectrum of medical personnel, from young, relatively inexperienced medical officers to highly skilled surgeons and experts in particular fields of medicine, all of which had skills and experience that would be relevant to the treatment of wounded as the war progressed, and different types of weapons would cause different types of wounds. And of course, once the introduction of poison gas came in, that would create a whole new methodology and approach to treating men with that type of wound, something that was hitherto pretty much unknown in civilian life before the war. In addition to the senior medical staff who carried out the treatment, performed the operations, assessed the patients, there was also a large number of medical orderlies that worked here, so thousands of men from the Royal Army Medical Corps, and also large numbers of women. Professional nurses from the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service, wartime volunteers in the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VADs. All of these had a vital role, and here along the Crimson Coast was probably the largest deployment of women on the Western fronts, because the British Army throughout the war was reluctant to put women in the face of danger, in the line of fire, but they had a vital role and a vital task to perform here in locations like this. And as we'll see with Etaples later on in the podcast, it wasn't just that traditional role of women caring for someone that was seen in places like this. By 1917, with the creation of the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, women were coming here to do labouring tasks just like the men. To further supplement the role of the Royal Army Medical Corps and the tasks that they had to perform, in places like Le Treport and right along the Crimson Coast was a large number of units from the British Red Cross Society, and also some overseas Red Cross organisations like the American Red Cross. These provided additional personnel to work alongside the RAMC and care for the wounded, but also there were quite a few examples of British Red Cross ambulance units being used to supplement the ambulances that were required to move the wounded around, whether that was from the railheads as men were brought in from the casualty clearing stations and then moved to the general or stationary hospitals, or once they had treatment there and required dispatch to a hospital ship or perhaps to a convalescent depot, the British Red Cross Society ambulances would then be used to move them around as well. Now, the Red Cross was not part of the British Army. It was on attachment, effectively, to the British Army. And a lot of the people that served in the Red Cross were conscientious objectors. This was one way that those with a conscience who were against the killing of man and didn't want to fight in the war could actually serve in a unit like this and do something to assist in the war effort, to save lives, to help treat the wounded, and not to take the life of a fellow man. So within the British Red Cross Society units that operate along this Crimson Coast, you do find a lot of men that you could describe as conscientious objectors, or had an objection to the war, to fighting, that precluded them from frontline service. In addition to the hospital facilities at Le Treport, Number 3 Convalescent Depot was also located here. Now, when soldiers were treated in country, so within the theatre of war, in this case the Western Front, if they required further treatment in the UK, then they would be sent via the hospital ships back to Britain. But if the treatment could take place within that general or stationary hospital and the soldier's wounds were patched up, he was given the treatment that was required and he recovered from those wounds, he wasn't then sent straight back to his battalion on the front line. He was sent to one of these convalescent depots where he would be given time to recover properly from the wounds, regain some of his strength, perhaps be given a bit more food, do a bit of light exercise, and gradually build him up for a proper return to active service. Now, at different parts of the war, and I encountered this when I interviewed veterans back in the 80s and 90s, they often spoke about being admitted to hospital along this Crimson Coast, and the medical officer, under pressure to return men to their regiments, rather than be given the full period of convalescence and everything that came with it, they'd have a few days of it and they'd be back up the line. So it wasn't by any means a perfect system, but at least there was a system to deal with this, and it was an important part of treating a soldier, allowing a soldier to recover, and returning him back to the battlefield. These convalescent depots were again made up of huts and tents, and again, talking to some of the veterans that I interviewed who were in places like this, they had quite a lot of spare time and they were able to go to the coast, see the seaside, look across the channel and think of dear old home across the seas there, and have time to reflect on the wounds that they'd just received and the battles in which they'd just been fighting, and reflect on that before they return once more to do it all over again. As the war moved forward at Le Treport, the size of the medical units grew and the number grew as well, and by 1918 it included the 16th American General Hospital, which received British and Commonwealth troops, but also increasingly began to receive American wounded coming back from the front, particularly men from the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Divisions who were fighting alongside British and Australian troops in the battles on the Hindenburg Line. So by that final phase of the war, Le Treport and the ground around it, it had become a major medical centre and an important part of the medical history of the British Army on the Western Front in the Great War. But as good as our medical facilities were, and as a British soldier being wounded on one of these battlefields and passed down to dressing station, casualty clearing station, and onwards to these base hospitals in places like Le Treport, there was always that chance that a soldier might not survive his wounds. With no antibiotics to treat infection, and infection was one of the greatest killers in the First World War, men injured on these battlefields, their wounds got infected because soil would come into the wound, be dragged into the wound by the bullet or the shell fragment, or when a soldier clutched his wound, as often they would do quite naturally, their hands were dirty and it would push the soil and with it all the bacteria into the wound and cause the infection. So infection was the great killer, and as try as we might, until, which was almost a generation later, proper antibiotics came in, it was impossible to stop soldiers dying from their wounds. So what that sadly means is that wherever we have these medical facilities along that Crimson Coast, that place where so much blood was shed in the attempt to save these men's lives, we do have cemeteries from the Great War as well. And here at Le Treport there are two main cemeteries, the original one in Le Treport town itself on a sloped area overlooking the sea in quite a picturesque location. In fact, it was the very first cemetery constructed. It's cemetery number 1, built just after the war in the style that we know now as part of one of the 3 experimental cemeteries. And we're going to do a podcast on those experimental cemeteries later on, so we'll return to that cemetery anon. The one that we're going to look at here at Le Treport, which is the much bigger one, is Mont Huon Military Cemetery, just outside the town. This one sits out in the countryside, close to the coastal area, and has over 2,000 burials from the Great War. This new cemetery was purposefully made here because the small communal cemetery, essentially, in Le Treport, the original cemetery, quickly filled up with burials and there was no more space to bury the dead. And as the war moved on into 1915 and 16, it was clear that a much bigger space would be required to bury the soldiers who did not survive those wounds, did not survive the sickness that they came back to, because it wasn't just wounds, it was sickness as well, particularly during the winter months. They needed a place to bury the dead, and these open fields here were an ideal location. Today, of those more than 2,000 burials, 1,841 are British, 120 are Canadian, 124 Australian, 33 New Zealanders, 9 South Africans, and 1 Indian. And in addition to that, there are over 200 Germans buried here. Why Germans? Well, German wounded came back from the battlefields in exactly the same way that British wounded did. The medical corps treated wounded, German wounded coming in, passed them down through the same evacuation chain as prisoners of war. The British and Commonwealth forces respected German wounded, treated German wounded in the same way that the Germans respected and treated British wounded as well. Several of the veterans that I interviewed were wounded and taken prisoner in 1918, and they had good medical treatment close to the battlefield. That got not so good the further they moved back. And again, perhaps prisoners of war and the treatment of prisoners of war is another chat for another day. But it meant that at the Treport, there were parts of the general hospitals there that were used for the treatment of what was essentially enemy wounded. And although there are some accounts of people coming here during the war and being surprised to see Germans, not in mixed wards, I mean, there wasn't a German next to the bed of a British Tommy from the Yorkshire Regiment, for example. They were in their own separate wounds, because essentially, remember, they were prisoners of war, so would have been partially under guard. But they would have been treated for whatever condition they had, whether that was wounds or sickness, And then, sadly, if they died, they would be buried here in this cemetery. They're in their own separate area, but that's not unusual in cemeteries that are behind the lines. By 1919, when the cemetery was closed, there were men still dying in the hospitals here at Le Treport from influenza, which was, of course, sweeping Europe in that pandemic more than a century ago. The cemetery at that time would have been a vast field of wooden crosses, perhaps with some more ornate memorials placed on the grave. Again, being away from the battlefield area, you do see this in contemporary pictures, some quite incredible monuments on the graves of men buried in these cemeteries along the Crimson Coast, and one or two of them in some of the cemeteries do survive. But this cemetery was made permanent, and Reginald Bloomfield, one of the chief architects of the then Imperial War Graves Commission, made the cemetery that we see today, replacing the wooden crosses with the Portland stone headstones. And when we look at the dead that are in here, we do see quite a lot from the Battle of the Somme in 1916. In that respect, it's a bit of a forgotten Somme cemetery, because men coming back from the battles of July and August, September, October of 1916 were brought back to Le Treport for treatment for their wounds, and when they died, they were buried here. So the ones that we know and visit and we see on the battlefields are only part of the story. Their comrades who made it beyond the Somme back to here, when they died, this is where we'll find them. And indeed that's true of a number of other cemeteries, St Saviour Cemetery in Rouen and Etaples, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, among the burials that are here, there are many stories amongst these 2,000 soldiers buried at Monthuon Military Cemetery, but one of them is particularly special to me because he's my great uncle, Bill Adams. William Walter Adams of the Northamptonshire Regiment. Prior to that, he'd served in his county regiment, the Essex Regiment. He'd worked as a navvy and a bargeman before the war on the River Hythe near Colchester in Essex. He grew up on Hythe Hill, just outside Colchester. His name is on the war memorial in the church on Hythe Hill. And his half-brother, Albert, also a bargeman, died in Mesopotamia serving with the inland water transport of the Royal Engineers along the Tigris. He's buried in a cemetery which, sadly, I would guess that I'm very unlikely to visit. I grew up on my grandmother's stories of this generation of cousins that she had, and Bill Adams and his brother Albert were two of them. And I heard their names as a child, really. She spoke about them and who were these people. And as I got older and got interested in the Great War, I began my search for them, because all she knew is they'd died in the war. She had no idea where or where they were buried, or even if they were buried anywhere. So back in those days, you had to contact the Commonwealth War Graves Commission by letter, and a letter would go off, and a few weeks later a reply would come back, and there was the details of Bill Adams buried here at Monthuon Cemetery. And I've been here quite a few times to visit his grave. She was a girl, my grandmother, when these lads went to war, and she had fond memories of them bouncing her on their knee when she was a child, so they were very special to her. And she told me the story of how when Bill Adams was wounded, and she thought it was shrapnel, but I've subsequently discovered through his service record, which is one of those that survives, that he was gassed at Passchendaele. He was by then serving with the Labour Corps, and they were building the railway sleeper, the corduroy tracking roads across the shell-smashed landscape of Third Ypres. He was gassed there, evacuated down the line of evacuation, dressing station, casualty clearing station, and eventually to the General Hospital here at Le Treport. And he seemed to be doing all right. And one thing that was possible during the war, which I suspect not many people are aware of, is that families could come to France to visit a gravely wounded soldier while he was in hospital. And Bill Adams's parents came from Colchester to do this. They were given a rail warrant to go from Colchester into London and then take the train from London down to Newhaven. They went across on an army ship from Newhaven to Dieppe, and at Dieppe they were probably met by Red Cross personnel who brought them up to the hospital where Bill Adams was being treated, and they saw their son. Now, I have no idea how long they spent with him, whether it was a day or just a few hours, whatever. They were then taken back for the next ship back to Newhaven, and on arrival in Newhaven, my grandmother said there was a telegram waiting for them there to say that Bill had died of his wounds. So they had that one last chance to see their son, which most families who lost someone in the Great War never had that chance. If they fell in the mud at Passchendaele or died in no man's land on the first day of the Somme, that chance was robbed of those families. Bill Adams' mum and dad got to see him one last time, and whether that was a curse or a comfort, I've no idea. But I always think of them when I come to Monthuon. Whether they returned after the war to visit his grave again, I don't know. But whatever, I come here now for them, to see him. A not untypical soldier of this period of the war. Didn't voluntarily enlist, he was a conscript, an older man, not one of these young Tommies marching to the front line and doing not fighting but general labouring tasks, but still at risk, caught by the gas at Passchendaele and died of his wounds here at Le Treport. And no doubt when other families, when other visitors come here to this cemetery, they have similar tales to tell. I know some of you listening to this podcast have relatives in this cemetery like me, and it's not the straightforward story of a soldier going over the top with bayonets fixed into no man's land. It's a more complex one, often a sadder one. Like Bill, perhaps, they almost made it. They almost made it home, here on the coast, so close to Blighty, so near, but yet always so far. And it's with those thoughts that we'll leave Le Treport now, and we're going to move further along the Crimson Coast to our next stop at the little seaside town of Etaples. Le Treport was in Normandy, and we've now moved along the Crimson Coast to the Pas-de-Calais, the next département. And Etaples, a small town on the coast based around the fishing industry, is where we are next. And close to Etaples, in the dunes, the sand dunes, was the location of not just hospitals that treated the wounded coming back from the front line, but by late 1916, the main IBD, infantry base depot of the British Army on the Western Front. Originally, that had been Rouen, because initially in the war, the route to France was Southampton to Le Havre. Le Havre was close to Rouen, there was good railway systems there, and you could process the troops very quickly. Troop ship to train or march to Rouen, get the unit sorted out in the infantry base depot or the draft sorted out in the depot, and then dispatch them by the same train system to the main British sectors on the Western Front in northern France and across the border in Belgium and Flanders. So up until the Battle of the Somme in 1916, that was still the main route for British soldiers to the battlefield. Southampton to Le Havre, Rouen for the base depot, and then up the line via whatever train system was required to get you where you needed to go. That changed because the army itself was changing. It was still growing. Although the Somme was typically seen as the graveyard of Kitchener's army, the New Army, the British Army was moving from a phase of volunteers, whether they be regulars, territorials or New Army men, to conscripts. Conscription came in 1916 in the approach to the Battle of the Somme, and the first conscripts began to arrive at the tail end of the Battle of the Somme in the autumn of 1916. So the army was growing and changing, and it needed much bigger facilities for its base depot, and the site at Etaples was chosen because it offered a massive area of space. And this new depot, which already existed in a small scale, was greatly expanded into the site that became famous in the last 2 years of the war, 1917 and 1918. To the troops, it wasn't Etaples, it was Etaples or Heel Taps. They were two of the ways in which they tried to pronounce that name. And the infantry base depot, or the infantry base depots, because there were a large number of them within the main area of the Etaples camp, became known to the men as the Bull Ring. This was an area where the training took place prior to you being sent off to your unit. And by 1917, a typical route, therefore, to the front would be Folkestone to Boulogne, and then from Boulogne down to Etaples. You'd be sent to a base depot. You might come over in a regimental draft, so let's say, a group of men from the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, which was a reserve unit based in Sussex. You've done your training with them as a conscript. You've been posted overseas with your county regiment. And on arrival at Etaples, you'd be sent to the base depot, given some in-country training. So you get up to speed on gas masks, machine guns, bayonet fighting, and whatever else was the latest in vogue bit of kit or approach to fighting that you needed to know about. And at that point, the army would then decide where to send you. Now, you might be sent to a battalion of your own regiment. So as a Royal Sussex draft, if Royal Sussex battalions had been in action somewhere on the Western Front and had depleted numbers, you might find yourself being sent to one of those. But increasingly as the war went on, men could be just transferred to another regiment. And sometimes it would be a case, and I remember one of the veterans that I interviewed in the 80s saying this, that they were put out on parade at Etaples. The regimental sergeant major of the depot where they were stepped forward and said, every other man 1 pace forward, and all of those men were then sent off to a completely different regiment. So you could have Cockneys being sent to the Manchester Regiment, Northerners being sent to the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, Scotsmen in the Royal Sussex Regiment, and lads from Kent being put into the Gordon Highlanders. The army became a true mix of personnel in that last phase of the war, and reinforcements being sent to the base depot here were sent where they were needed rather than to the regiment in which they might have originally enlisted. So those of you who researched your ancestors and found they're in regiments that you don't associate where they come from, very often that is the reason. And this was obviously a good way to employ men because it meant they went where they were required, but it broke down the whole identity of regiments, and you see those identities change and the bonds between those men change as well. But it also, to a degree, limited the effects of casualties on particular locations. So it wasn't so much that the army abandoned the concept of POWs or local territorials. It was that the army itself changed naturally, and men from all over Britain could serve in the same unit together rather than being from one specific location. So when they went over the top into battle, it didn't mean that that location suddenly suffered grievous casualties and went into mourning, as had happened on so many occasions in the early phase of the war. The camps and the training ground, the bull ring, was massive. It was a massive area, and I'll put a map of it onto the Old Frontline website, oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll put some other material on there relating to Treport as well, so you can see, to give you an idea of the scale of these places. And at one point in 1917, for example, here at Etaples, there was over 100,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers here, either going to the front, having just arrived, or men had come here for particular bits of training before being sent back to their units, but the bulk of them men, fresh recruits having arrived, being dispatched to new units, or men having been wounded previously in the war, had now been graded fit enough to return and arrived at Etaples before awaiting their move. Now, again, most of those men hoped that they would go back to their original battalion, but you had men being sent everywhere. Horace Ham, who I interviewed, who was wounded with the 16th Public Schools Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, on the first day of the Somme, when he came to Etaples after recovering from those wounds on the Somme in 1916, he was then sent to the 12th Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, in a completely different division, and he arrived and served with men who he'd never met before. And this, again, was much more common as the war went on. If you watch television in the 1980s, you may remember Paul McGann in A Monocled Mutineer, which was the story of Percy Topless, and the Etaples mutiny of September 1917 featured in that, with Topless seemingly playing a very important role in it. I would say now that the research that's been done on that subject somewhat disproves that drama. It's a fantastic bit of drama, and one that I could watch again and again and again, and it gives you quite a good insight into what Etaples was like in 1917. But the mutiny was much more complex, and the reasons behind it more complex, and it is something that I do intend to do a podcast on further down the line. But the mutiny in 1917 really didn't change anything, and in many respects it was partly about soldiers having a chance to get into town to frequent the favours of mademoiselles before they went up the line to, in their mind, perhaps certain death. All of that didn't really, the rioting, the deaths, and there were a few, Nothing on the scale of what you see in Monocle Mutineer. That didn't really change the way that the army did things here. The process of moving men through what was really a big machine to train them up, get them ready, and dispatch where they were needed continued right until the end of the conflict. And like I say, we'll return to that subject of mutiny, if that's the right word for it. I know quite a few historians are not comfortable with that phrase, but we'll return to the Etaples mutiny in another podcast. But the important thing about the base depot, particularly in that last phase of the war, is just how multinational it was, because by this stage of the Great War, men from every part of Britain were here, and also every corner of the British Empire. It was a multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic force drawn from all over the world, and men of every creed and backgrounds were here. And it reflected the whole aspect of the British Army at this time. It was not just by then a white army, and even within the ranks of the British Army itself, there were British-born black soldiers serving here, something that we've discussed in the podcast before. And if the depot reflected the changing nature of the British and Empire forces, it also reflected the changing role of women. The Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, formed during the conflict, had a depot here at Etaples, and this was a labour unit which was all female personnel. This was new and groundbreaking because it saw women outside of a traditional role being employed, not on the battlefield. No British women fought in the British trenches of the Great War. They were precluded from that. But that traditional role of women being in the caring sector, being nurses, was challenged by the employment of women as labour troops, which is what the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, the QMACs, were all about. And they did quite a variety of roles, and there are some great photographs of the work that they did in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. One of the tasks was to work on the cemeteries. There are photographs of them tending to the graves, digging the graves, repairing the graves in quite a few of the cemeteries on the Western Front during the war. By the time the QMACs were disbanded in 1921, more than 50,000 women had served in this role. Less than 100 had died. They weren't deployed, as I say, on battlefields, but some died in bombing or of sickness or of influenza as the influenza epidemic swept across Europe. But that role and the employment of women in that way, both here with the QMACs and the employment of the Women's Land Army in Britain for the very first time, really changed the whole way that women were viewed in how they could serve in a conflict, something that would only grow come the Second World War a generation later. In addition to the base depot, Etaples was completely surrounded by military hospitals receiving the wounded in exactly the same way the wounded was coming back from the front directly to Treport and the other locations along the Crimson Coast. And the hospitals here, 3 of them remained open into 1919, 10 months after the end of the armistice, and the QMAC's depot also remained here at that time. So Etaples was not just one of the largest British bases in our military history, which it was also this great reception area for the wounded. And again, when men come in wounded, they die of their wounds, so it's no surprising there was a cemetery here as well. And Etaples Military Cemetery is where we'll head to next. When you arrive at Etaples Military Cemetery coming north out of Etaples town, it's along a dead straight bit of road, almost certainly an old Roman road, and you're in amongst the dunes. The area of the bull ring and the training ground was across to your right, and if you wander off into there, you will find some of the remnants of that, barbed wire pickets, barbed wire and other things still in place from more than a century ago. But when you get to the cemetery and you see the pathway in, it's not really apparent just how big this cemetery is. It's hidden by the trees, and it's set between the road and the railway line. Again, Etaples was chosen because of its communication links. And in that big area between the road and the railway line is the cemetery. And as you walk in, you see the two massive towers designed by Edwin Lutyens, one of the principal architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The cemetery was designed by him and George Hartley Goldsmith. And as you come in and the path goes down between those two towers, this vast field of the dead is presented before you. It's a cemetery that gives the appearance of being much bigger than Tyne Cot, which we know as the biggest British and Commonwealth cemetery from the Great War. And in some respects, it is bigger than Tyne Cot. It covers a massive area of over 14 acres, and it is the largest British and Commonwealth cemetery in France from either World War. There are 11,388 burials here, and when you break that down, the majority are British, but of the others, there's 1,143 Canadian, 464 Australian, 261 New Zealand, 68 South African, 23 Indian, 3 Belgians, and 650 Germans. Now, as we mentioned with Le Treport, Monthuon Cemetery, with the wounded German soldiers coming in from the battlefields and being treated and died of their wounds there, with the greater number of hospitals that existed in the last phase of the war here at Etaples, it's not surprising that the number of German burials here is much greater. And in addition to the Great War burials, there are 82 Second World War graves. Now, when we come down into Etaples, essentially a big chunk of the cemetery is in date order. You can follow periods of the war, so you can go to a plot during the Third Battle of Ypres and see the peaks and the troughs as the wounded come in and men die of their wounds. Graves from the early part of August of men wounded on the 31st of July, and then with the crossing of the Steambeek on the 16th of August, you see another peak then. And that's true of not just Third Ypres, but several battlefields and battles of 1917-18 reflected in the burials that are here at Etaples. But there are separate plots within this cemetery, separate officer plots. This was very common in cemeteries behind the lines. The old social distinctions of class would be perpetuated in the burials. So, in the past, the aristocracy might be buried aside from the ordinary people, and that was reflected in the burials here. The officers were buried separately to the men. You see that changing in the final phase of the war, with far more officers being buried in the regular plots with the men. And of course, the nearer you get to the battlefield throughout the war, there was no distinction between burying officers away from the men they fought alongside, because in the front line, everyone shared the same privations. But aside from the separate officer plots, there are separate plots for women, although the women are generally buried in the officer plots because they were given a sort of officer status in many respects. But I've come across separate Jewish plots in this cemetery where Jewish soldiers who died of their wounds were all buried together in a Jewish section of the cemetery, possibly on ground blessed by a Jewish padre. There's also a separate black soldiers plot within the cemetery, and having a lifelong interest with the Great War and soldiers, black soldiers in the British Army, it was something that I came across in the 1980s, that there was a plot of men from the British West Indies Regiment here buried separately to the others, but amongst them quite a few Canadians. And when I looked into those Canadians, they were black Canadians who'd served in regular battalions of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So it's not done as a distinction or any disrespect to these men. It was something that reflected civilian burial approaches in the Edwardian period before the Great War, and reflected, I guess, the layout and design of cemeteries then. So these cemeteries made away from the fighting, where this sort of consideration could be made, this is what you see: separate plots for separate types of people from different backgrounds. So it's a common feature of many of these behind-the-lines cemeteries. Now again, I tend to come to Etaples and record an episode in the cemetery itself and go around and talk about some of the graves that are here. But in a broader spectrum for this podcast, what the burials in this cemetery reflect is that broad cross-section of British and Commonwealth forces in those final years of the Great War. Men have been buried here from 1915, but the bulk of the burials are from 1916 until the end of the conflict. When we look at the men that are here and we break it down by unit, we get some interesting statistics there. We see, for example, that the largest number of graves in the cemetery, 584 of them, are from men in the Royal Field Artillery. Now, this is way too far back for these gunners to be firing their guns at the enemy positions on the Western Front. These are men evacuated, wounded, and have died of their wounds, and it reflects the growing importance of the artillery as the war progresses. The guns become both the king and the queen of the battlefields by 1918, and the losses amongst the gunners, who the infantry often referred to as 1,000-mile snipers, were quite considerable, both at the gun sites themselves and in the forward observation teams that had to direct the fire of the gun on the battlefield itself. So it reflects that. And there are many infantry regiments that had large numbers of battalions, reflected in great numbers here, the Manchester Regiment, Northumberland Fusiliers being amongst those. When we look at ranks, we see a big, broad cross-section of those, from ordinary soldiers up to senior officers. There are 2 brigadier generals buried at Etaples and 16 lieutenant colonels, the bulk of them battalion commanders. There are also nurses buried here. Again, it reflects the role of women on this part of the Crimson Coast, both in terms of the nurses. There are 3 nurses from the Queen Alexander's Imperial Nursing Service buried here. There are 4 Canadian nurses. In addition to those, there are 5 members of the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Labour unit that we spoke about, and there are 3 members of the YMCA buried here at Etaples, including 2 women. And they were operating huts for the troops where they could get tea and buns, writing paper to write home, quiet area to sit in. And the camp and the area around the hospitals was bombed in the latter stage of the war, with Gotha bombers coming over, used by the Germans in that final phase to long-distance bomb locations like this. They weren't targeting the hospitals or the recreation areas. There was the military camp alongside these, and there were no smart bombs, so bombs dropped in the wrong place and there were casualties. And when we look at the cause of death in this cemetery, we see a big, broad spectrum of the many types of wounds that soldiers came back with, which resulted, sadly, in them losing their lives as a consequence of these wounds. But we see men who drowned, who went swimming while based in one of the convalescent depots nearby, for example, and got into trouble when they went into the sea. And sadly, there's even examples in here of men taking their own lives. So it is this cemetery that gives this, like perhaps no other, this big, broad cross-section of the sort of men and women that were part of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. Further afield, close to the sites of the trenches and the mine craters and the shell holes, are their brethren who died in battle. But here are those who almost made it home, but not quite. And they too, like all of the others, echo that great history of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.